Hello everyone. In this video we are going to learn about the GRACE mission and the fundamentals of how it can be used to calculate groundwater storage change in aquifers and large basins. First of all, the GRACE stands for the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, which is a NASA mission, and the original mission went from 2002 to 2017. The satellites were designed for a life of about something like 7 to 10 years, but they ended up lasting for 15 years, although they had intermittent problems along the way. But then they gave out in 2017, and then 1 year later in 2018, NASA launched a new pair of satellites, which is called the GRACE-FO mission. FO stands for follow-on, and those satellites have been working flawlessly since 2018, and we're hopeful that they'll have a long mission life. So as you can see, GRACE involves two separate satellites, and then there's a laser between the two satellites that carefully measures the distance between them. And one satellite follows the other, and they rotate around the Earth in a pattern where over the course of about a month, it covers the entire Earth. And this is not to scale. The satellites are actually a very long distance apart. So they are about 500 kilometers above the Earth and separated by about 220 kilometers. And the way it works is, again, there's a laser that very carefully and accurately measures the distance between the two satellites. And as one follows the other, as the satellite approaches some change in mass on the Earth's surface, for example, a mountain range, then there would be a slight gravitational pull of that mountain range on that first satellite, which would cause the distance between the two satellites to increase slightly. And then once it goes over the satellite, or the front satellite goes over the mountain range, it pulls it back a little bit, which causes the distance to shorten. Eventually, it will tug on the second satellite, and then finally, when the second satellite passes it, it'll pull on that rear satellite, increasing the distance. So in other words, as those two satellites pass over anything on the surface of the Earth which results in a change in mass, the distance between the satellites just oscillates or varies on a subtle basis, and that's measured. Well, those variations in that distance are then mapped to a gravity anomaly. So they get it's a map of how the Earth's gravitational field varies spatially. But what's more important is how that then changes over time. If you create that map and then go back a month later and measure it again, any change in the Earth's gravitational field, hence the term anomaly, represents it could represent the shifting of a tectonic plate or something, but they can factor that in. But it's thought to represent primarily changes in water storage on the Earth's surface. And that is then converted by NASA to a data set representing a total water storage anomaly, or again, from a month to month, how much the total water storage is changing. And that change is represented in units of what's called liquid water equivalent in centimeters. So for each of these grid cells, let's say the anomaly is plus 1.5 centimeters. That means over that month, the amount of water that was gained in that grid cell would be equivalent to covering the entire grid cell with 1.5 centimeters of water. And so they use this simple metric or measure to delineate the scale of the transformation. And you can see from this map, this is a map of the total water storage anomaly over the entire Earth. The native raw grid cells are somewhat coarse. They're about 3 degrees by 3 degrees in scale. And those, I mentioned anomalies. When you do a change, it's not just from one month to the next. The changes are relative to a baseline. And at some point in the mission, it was decided that the baseline for reporting the anomalies would be if you take the average total water storage signal from 2004 to 2009, then that becomes the baseline and everything is measured relative to that. And so that you'll see that in all the plots that we present. Now that gives us total water storage, but what we're really interested in is the change in groundwater storage. And to get that, we somehow have to convert the total water storage to groundwater storage, and that's done through the use of a secondary data set called GLDAS, GLDAS, Global Land Data Assimilation System. And this is another product from NASA, but it consists of 3, and I think in the most recent version there might even be a 4th land surface model. But the primary ones are NOAA, VIC, and CLSM. A land surface model simulates basically the water cycle, precipitation, runoff, infiltration, accumulation of snow, snowmelt, temperature, and it has a very large number of variables, and it uses satellite data as input, and it outputs data sets on a gridded scale. And some of those outputs include what we call terrestrial water storage, terrestrial water components, and that would be plant canopy storage, water stored in plants, snow water equivalent, so a certain thickness of water stored in snow and how that varies spatially. Surface water, this would be water stored in rivers and lakes and reservoirs, but that generally for most places on the planet is a very small number relative to the others. And then the biggest one of these globally is soil moisture, and that is the near surface, water that's stored right at the uppermost profile of the soil, the 2 meters or so. And that can vary dramatically based on, rainfall and drought, and it represents a pretty significant amount of water. And so if you take those terrestrial water storage components and convert them to, again, to an anomaly based on a 2004 to 2009 baseline, we then label that as follows in this equation. So GWA, and it's sometimes written GWSA, is the groundwater storage anomaly, and that is equal to the total water storage anomaly minus the sum of the terrestrial water components, snow water, canopy storage, and soil moisture. So basically we're taking the total water storage and subtracting out the simulated data set of things that represent everything but groundwater, and we're left with an estimate of the groundwater storage anomaly. I mentioned the soil moisture is the biggest part of these terrestrial water components. I mean, the groundwater is the largest part, but of the terrestrial water components, the soil moisture is significant, and each of these models calculate the soil moisture a little bit differently. They have different variables. CLSM uses a single data set. NOAA and VIC output it at different layers or depths. So we have to deal with that. And by the way, I should mention that when we do this in our GGST app, which we'll talk about in a subsequent presentation, to get the snow water equivalent canopy storage and soil moisture, we take the average of each of the three different GLDAS models, VIC, CLSM, and NOAA. And those, when we do that, we have to deal with different grid resolutions. So the GRACE terrestrial water storage, I mentioned earlier that the raw GRACE data is at 3 degrees by 3 degrees, but NASA does a downscaling analysis, a numerical analysis, where they take that signal and they try to refine it and sharpen it, and they end up outputting, they produce a total water storage anomaly data set that's 1/2 by 1/2 degree longitude and latitude. And then for the NOAA, remember there are three models in GLDAS, NOAA, VIC, and CLSM. The NOAA data set is at 0.25 by 0.25 degree. The GLDAS data set, or excuse me, the VIC and CLSM are at 1 degree by 1 degree. And since we have to get everything to the same grid resolution, rather than just splitting the VIC CLSM, we upscale the terrestrial water storage and the NOAA data sets to 1 degree. Therefore, our derived groundwater storage anomaly is at 1 degree by 1 degree. And you'll see that later in some of the outputs that we have. And for the GL, we also compute an uncertainty associated with these. NASA directly provides an uncertainty estimate for the terrestrial water storage, which is shown in this equation as sigma TWSA, this one right here. And then for each of the others, these uncertainties are calculated as a standard deviation based on the variations in each of the three data sets between the NOAA, VIC, and CLSM models. And so we combine that using this equation, and we end up with an uncertainty estimate for the groundwater storage anomaly. And later in our app, you will, and in a lot of the plots that we generate, you'll see a thick line in the middle, and then this colored band around it. Well, the thick line represents the actual value, and then the thickness of this other line represents the uncertainty. So we believe the answer is somewhere in that colored band, and most likely where the dark band is. Anyway, so those are the basics of how the GRACE mission works, the data sets it provides, and how we convert that to a groundwater storage anomaly.